When we think of steam post-World War II, we think of large and modern designs, pushing the envelope of steam power, and moving toward modernization with diesels and electrics. India, however, did something a little different. Coming out of World War II, a lot was going on for India. They gained independence from England in 1947, and the partition split parts of to Pakistan. Both of these are topics that are well worth doing a deeper dive into beyond just what the railways were doing, and I recommend doing as such. Coming out of World War II and independence, motive power on the broad gauge consisted of World War I and earlier BISA, or British Engineering Standard Association, 060, 440, and 460 types, post-World War I IRS, or Indian Railways Standard Type 462s and 282s, and a sizable chunk of Baldwin-built AWE 282s, Baldwin and Montreal Locomotive Works made AWD and CWD 282s, and the ever-ubiquitous S160, known here as the AWC. During the war, it had been noticed how much more reliable and easy to maintain the American and Canadian-built machines were. Up to that point, almost all railways in India bought engines from England based on either BISA or IRS designs, and while not true to every country under British rule at the time, some of the engines provided were less than perfect. The XV Class 462 being a perfect example with steaming issues, several instances of premature metal fatigue, and perhaps the most known, the tendency to hunt from side to side at speed, slamming the heck out of the track, and often causing derailments. It also didn't help that these engines were not always up to the conditions encountered in India either. When India decided to design a new batch of standard locomotives for all gauges, it was little wonder that the designs followed American practice. And on the broad gauge, this was brought about with the introduction of the WP Class Pacific and the WG Class Mikado, W standing for wide, broad gauge, and P and G for passenger and goods respectively. The Indian Railways, at least for the WP, were unsure of its success. While it was based loosely on the USRA Pacific and the IRS standard XC class, it was still a new design and thus unknown how it would perform, so an idea was hatched. Instead of ordering an initial 100 engines, Baldwin would produce 16, but what would fill out the rest of the order? The H, HP, and later HPS, the superheated steam version, were classes of 460 designed during the BISA era and dated from 1910. These were the quintessential Indian mail engines, trusted with handling named trains and expresses until the larger IRS designs displaced them, although not fully with their reliability issues. By the time of independence, many of these engines were still on the roster of the various railways, which gave the government railway a new idea. Fill out the rest of the new locomotive order with a new HPS. Filling out the other 84 engines of that 100 engine order, Vulcan Foundry in England produced the HPS2, with the plan that if the new WP class turned out to be a flop, the old reliable design would save the day. The HPS2s were a little more modern than their 1910 ancestors, but not by much, and despite their late 1940s construction dates, the engines looked nothing like it. The most noticeable thing was the engines retained splashers on their running boards, a design feature of Victorian-era steam that had long been moved away from. The engines went to work alongside WPs on each railway, and as time ticked by, the WPs proved themselves to be reliable performers and easier to maintain. This, of course, would lead to another 739 engines to be built, both abroad and later in-house at Indian Railway's own Chittaranjan workshops, to take over as the primary broad-gauge passenger engine. This cascaded the HPS2s into secondary roles, which for a while they did just fine. India, however, was slowly modernizing, and in the same way that they had done with the WPs and HPSs years before, slow and methodical. Tenders were put out to EMD and ALCO for a diesel to revolutionize the broad gauge, and wires were strung on main trunk lines for electrification. Steam construction ended in 1970/71, but since the 60s, IR had been building new diesels and electrics, in some cases right alongside the last batches of steam at Chittaranjan. The HPS/HPS2s, some zones of Indian Railways referred to them as just HPSs, but we're not going down that rabbit hole this time, continued to work their mundane passenger assignments into the 1980s, outlasting most of their older siblings during IR's coal of pre-war designs in the mid to late 1970s. Most enthusiasts at the time thought they'd be last alongside the more modern WPs and WGs, but it was not to be. First and foremost, many of the lines the engines were assigned to for commuter work were slowly being electrified, and the commuter trains they ran became electric multiple units when the wires went live. For a while they'd work alongside them, working in places the wires didn't reach. but even this didn't last forever. The thing with IR's modernization was a trickle-down effect from motive power. New contract-built Alco diesels would take over freight work from the WGs, the youngest of which were barely 10 years old. These younger members would then find themselves in mixed traffic or passenger roles that would bump older classes off to be scrapped, which is exactly what happened to the HPS2s as the 1980s took hold. Any that weren't bumped by electrification were bumped by WGs, bringing an end to the Indian mail engine. Steam on the Indian Railways broad gauge would end in 1996, and luckily, amongst the smattering of preserved WPs and WGs, two broad gauge 460s would survive. HPS2 24467 is preserved at India's National Railway Museum in New Delhi, and original HPS number 32 at the Railway Museum in Kolkata. The HPS2 story is definitely unique in Steam history, and although not the only time a repeat order like this has happened, it ranks as interesting to me because these 460s being such an old design, and honestly probably being one of the last classes of 460 steam locomotive ever built in the world. Thanks for watching another one of Liam's Foreign Steam videos. Decided to do another one of these little short ones because I really like the HPS2s, and I like the idea of getting more of these just short, quick videos out about classes I like that I can share with you people. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hopefully we'll have another video up after this soon. Thanks for watching.